Hi, so the topic of my paper is the involuntary sterilization of Indigenous women. And this is a heavy topic, right? Just going into it, this was a difficult thing for me to write. Um, I am Native. My grandmother was born on a reservation, and it's a big part of my identity, knowing my history and the way that that is going to impact my career and the decision making in my life. So I chose the topic as a way to kind of give a voice to those people who have suffered. And, it might seem like a harsh thing to talk about because it is, in a way, it's a very strong criticism of the United States government and the medical institution. But really, my goal is not to generate hostility toward either of those institutions, but rather just a critique that hopefully will prevent these kind of things from happening again. So you can see that my first slide here is a hospital in the 1970s, because that's kind of where the legislation began that led to the sterilization of Indigenous women. So in the 1970s, the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act was passed by the United States government, actually in 1970. And the goal of that was to provide contraception methods for impoverished people. So not just Indigenous Americans, although they were a large segment of that population. Really, it was just for people who were poor, who lived below the poverty line. And then Title X grew out of the Public Health Service Act. Became very popular through the 1970s and 80s. They received a lot of funding, and then Medicaid began funding them under Title X. And really what they were doing was developing infrastructure in and around reservations that provided healthcare to Indigenous women. And I think that the goal there, in the 1970s, there was concern, I guess, throughout the United States that we were going to overpopulate the earth. So overpopulation was a big problem, running out of resources. There was fear that we would run out of food at some point. And I think that within the context of what was happening, that's important to recognize. Traditional methods of contraception were actually outlawed on reservations, and they were expected to receive all of their medical care through the United States government, or in other words, Indian Health Services. And they would establish Indian Health Service locations in and around the reservations. And the hard thing is that once you've outlawed it, they really had no choice, right? They could no longer do they had midwifery and other methods that, spiritual methods and things to bring children into the world. But it was also, there were high mortality rates. It certainly wasn't a perfect thing, but during the 1970s and 80s, approximately 25% of Native women were sterilized. And really, based on the research that I did, that's possibly a low ball. It may have been as much as 50%. And there's no real way to assess that in its entirety, because some women didn't report it, and they wouldn't, and they might not have even known, or maybe when family planning became an issue, they decided it wasn't worth exploring and reporting. The women who were reporting and talking about these kind of things were usually in local newspapers and things run by their tribes. There are quite a few documented cases, so I just kind of had to pick from those cases, and that's the hard thing, is there are a lot of them. And one of them was a 26-year-old woman who in the 1970s came in, and she wanted a womb transplant. She'd been told by her physician that her hysterectomy was reversible and that she could have children. And she was ready to start a family at that point. She's married, and she left that doctor's office in tears because she realized that she was never going to have children. And another case was two 15-year-old girls who came in for appendectomies and received tubal ligations, and they did not even know that they got those. Their parents weren't told, and they weren't told until they were well into adulthood. And that it was taken from them as children. And another woman came in complaining of headaches, and the doctor's prescription of that was that she had woman troubles and that she needed to have a hysterectomy. And she did, and later they discovered that she had a tumor in her head, and that was the real reason. And, the hard thing is here is that it's tough to look at the physicians and say that they are diabolical or they are monsters. I think that you have to kind of look at the tone of what's happening here in the 1970s, right? They're afraid of overpopulation, but also the idea of eugenics was popularized in the early 1900s and really carried through and is still a theme, probably even today. I know that it's largely been discredited, but this is kind of the tone that people are living with, where they're kind of weeding out what they might consider undesirable. So it is bad. It is wrong. I mean, clearly. And it's the tough part is that there are thousands of cases like this that happened around the United States. And it wasn't just to Indigenous women, it was also happening to really anybody in a minority status or who represented something that I think was viewed as an undesirable element of society. And it's tough for me to even say those words because that right there hits home. What we're really talking about is my family, the people that raised me or that I knew as a child. That I was born in the 1980s, and we're really not talking about that long ago. Since in the late 1970s, they began to do the United States began to kind of inspect what was happening, and I think that they realized that there was a problem. And in one study, they were just looking at 4 locations, and they found that over 3,000 women, many, a portion of whom were under the age of 21. 36 of them, 36 of the 3,000 of the 3,400 were under the age of 21. So it wasn't something just happening to adults, it was happening to minors. And the government represents the institution that you should trust, and the IHS was certainly it still is within the government purview. And so that's where they would go, that's where the trusted healthcare was, and what they were receiving was something that was very deceptive. In a lot of cases, they didn't explain what the sterilization process was doing, or they would say that it was reversible, or they did not wait, the 72-hour waiting period. Documents weren't signed, or they were forged signatures. It happened a lot, and it was fairly widespread. In the numbers that I just quoted, the 3,400 and under the age of 20, 36 and under the age of 21, we're really talking about just 4 locations, and we're only talking about what was documented. It was more widespread. And when you look at the fact that 90% of those sterilizations, not just on Native women, right, because it is more than that, it's just Native women happen to be inside of the scope of that. It was funded by the US government. It wasn't just the physicians, it was actually part of legislation. And so poor minority women were being legislated against, and that's recent history. In Canada, there are cases as recent as, within the last decade. I know that the title of this, this is a news clipping. This is the head of one, and it is dated 2015, but there are others as recent as 2018, 2019. And like cases where women have been sterilized without their knowledge in 2019 in Canada, and that is staggering to me. It's not ancient history, so it is relevant. And given that I would like to go into an administrative position in medicine, I think that it's important to recognize that this is one of the issues. And if we want to provide the very best possible care, you have to be willing to treat people with equality, because we live in a really diverse world and environment, and we need to be willing and able to look at people with equality that way and not allow that kind of thing to take place in our clinics. And understanding the history is one of the ways that we can do that, that we can be cognizant of the dangers and make sure that everybody has the information that they need in the decision-making process. These women really just needed to be told, they needed to be informed and be able to make their own choices. And so moving forward with my interest being in healthcare, I think it's really vital to understand the history, to recognize it, and to be willing to push to protect informed consent and due process, right? There's a waiting period for those kind of procedures for a reason. So anyway, thank you for listening. This was really tough to talk through. I'm trying to just stay. I tried to maintain a tone throughout the paper and in the presentation. I don't want to get emotional, and I don't want to be explosive or even defamatory. I want to very calmly assess what's happened, even though it's difficult. So thank you for listening.